still all very grateful that he had rescued Maria from the fire, and he was sure that they were kind, all except Carlo, that is. But something was sure to happen soon, which would make them realise how different he was. The children's mother sometimes looked at him questioningly, and she no longer attempted to caress him. She would touch his hair lightly when they were going to bed, but David knew it was no longer because she wanted to. She did it only out of kindness so that she should not have to feel different from her own children. David was not all clear how he knew this. He just knew it. It was not like he liked anyone to touch him. He hated it. It made him feel tense inside. But sometimes when he saw the children and their parents touch one another, he felt a stab of pain and remembered Johannes. Perhaps he had been like everybody else to start with. Perhaps it was only when Johannes had died that he'd become different. David tried not to think about it, but he had to admit that when Maria touched him, he did not hate it. Sometimes she would take him by the hand when they walked side by side, and her hand was small and soft, not in the least like a boy's. And when Maria held his hand, it was as if they were speaking a pleasant thing together without saying anything. Yet it always made him a little uneasy, like something important had escaped his memory. David turned over in bed. There was something else he had forgotten. What was it? Something about Denmark, something he had to the point of remembering the first day he was there. It had something to do with the man that had said something of North will come when he came to Denmark. Suddenly, he knew what it was. Milk. The children's parents were very good to them. They gave them everything they needed and talked a great deal about what they would do good. Every day the children were given milk and these things called vitamins. David was given them too, and he had had milk before. Twice a week for as long as he could remember, on Tuesdays and Fridays, he had had to go across to the man's quarters, and the man had given him something white to drink. It tasted horrible, but the man told him he must drink it or else he would shoot one of the prisoners. He also threatened to shoot a prisoner if David ever told anyone where he went and what he did. Nothing happened except that David drank the horrible white stuff. At the time, David had thought it showed how stupid they were as well as evil. It did not make him ill, and neither did it die either. The man just had to realise it was not poisonous enough to kill him, and yet he went on giving it to David to drink. The milk he was given there did not taste unpleasant, and it was whiter too, but it was all the same for that. And the first time David happened to bite one of the pills that were called vitamins and drank his milk right on top of it, it tasted horrible in just the way it used to be in camp. So the man had given him something that was good for him, something to make him strong and not always ill and weak like the other prisoners. Why? David sat up wide awake in bed. Why had he been forced to drink something that was good for him? If he had been some sort of importance as a hostage, then obviously he must be allowed to die. But in that case, why did the man tell David to escape? It had all happened as the man had told him. There had been the bundle lying beneath the tree, and he had got to Salonika, and he'd been a ship there. David got up and dressed. He could not sleep. He could not stay inside the house. He must think. But no matter how much he thought, he could not find the answer. He walked quietly downstairs into the garden so that no one should hear him. But although he stared right into the darkness and thought about the man as hard as he could, he still could not make head or tail of it. The man hated him. David knew all about hate, and he was sure the man hated him. An important hostage would have kept him alive, but he must not be allowed to escape, must he? If only he knew more about it. If only he knew something about Denmark. If there was a king in Denmark, then he would have to try to get there. There must be some reason why he was told to escape. For one moment he thought he knew what it was. You could not bribe most honest people, but they took bribes. Being bribed meant doing something you knew was forbidden, just to get something for yourself. But who had bribed the man to let David escape? He was just David, a boy who had always been a prisoner, someone he stood hostage for without knowing it. But who could it be? And if he had been an important hostage, then the man would never have dared him to let him escape. In that country, they were all terrified of one another. Perhaps if the bribe were being enough, but all of the answer, then they would be hunting for him, everywhere, and he would have to be on his guard day and night. It must not be true. David's hands clutched his fast-beating heart. There must be a reason he could not understand. He did not want to be an important hostage, for he did not want to go on being as frightened as he was. The next morning he could ask the children's father if there was a king in Denmark, and if so, then he would leave at once, and he would travel by car as often as possible, or he would not manage the journey. But it would not do for him to believe that he was an important hostage, for if he did not dare to ask a little lift of money or bribe bread or anything. But he never got as far as asking the children's father if there was a king of Denmark. He decided he would creep back into the bed again. But just as he was going past the big living room that gave onto the terrace, the light was switched on and the children's father and mother entered and sat down. David pressed himself against the wall and stood still. When they began talking, he would creep off in the other direction so that they would not spot him. Through the slats in the shutters, he saw the children's mother take up her sewing. She put it down again almost at once, turning to her husband and said, "Giovanni, I think I'll have to do something about David." David moved with an infinite care away from the slatted shutters. Sometimes when you are looking at people, they become aware of it, and he leaned against the wall and shut his eyes. "What should I do about him, Elsa? Is there something the matter with him?" David would never forget what they said. "The matter? Yes, I mean, how long do you suppose he should stay here?" "Have you anything against the lad, my dear?" "Yes. No. Oh, I'm bound to love a child who saved my own child's life, but I just don't understand him. If it didn't sound so absurd, I'd be inclined to say he frightens me." "He's an unusual child, that I grant you, but I can't see what you have against him." Well, let me put it this way. I've nothing against David as David, but I do object him as the company for my own children. He must leave here as soon as possible." "Can't you tell me exactly what it is about him that you object to?" "I just don't know who he is. I don't know where he comes from, and I don't know where he's going to. I don't believe he's truthful. That story about belonging to a circus, it just doesn't hang together properly. Giovanni, if he belongs to the circus, there are things he ought to know that he obviously doesn't. And at the same time, the story's so carefully worked out, as if it was hardened by a little liar." "With eyes like his, Elsa?" "Yes, and his eyes frighten me too. They're eyes of an old man who's seen much in the life that no longer cares to be going on living. They're not even desperate, just quiet and expectant and very, very lonely. As if they were quite alone of his free choice. Giovanni, a child's eyes don't look like that. There's something wrong there. And his smile, if it weren't so incredible, I'd be tempted to say it looks as if he's never smiled before he's had eyes on Maria. He never smiles at the rest of us. He just looks at us politely and with dead earnestness. And when he smiles at Maria, it's very beautiful, Elsa. I've seen it myself. It comes so hesitantly and yet so tenderly." "Oh, you make me feel so heartless, but I must put my own children first and think of their welfare. And there's something wrong with a child who smiles like that. Where does it come from? You can tell he has no near relatives, but he makes it quite clear that he doesn't ask to question him. He answers politely, but his face must come watchful, and he replies as briefly as he can. It's not that I want to pry, Giovanni, but you must admit he's a strange child. He arrives here out of the blue, dressed in a pair of trousers and a shirt, both in such a shocking condition that even the poorest beggar would scorn them. He owns a knife and an empty bottle, which he obviously regards as vital necessities, and yet he speaks Italian. Yes, and French, like a senior member of the French Academy. He does what? I found him with a French book the other day, and he asked me to read a few lines to him. I naturally thought he wanted them translated, but he only wanted to compare the sound of words with their appearance in print. He's obviously never seen French written, but he speaks it like a native. And like a very gifted and well-educated native too. Yes, and then I suppose he explained it away by saying there was a man in a circus who was French. Exactly, heaven knows what kind of circus it is. I'm sure that there's no circus. Can't you see there's something mysterious and wrong about it all? At first I imagined he'd run away from school or something of the sort, but to judge from his speech you'd think he came from a family that moved heaven and earth along to go to find him. Yet there's not been a word of search made for the child of any people that we know. So where does he get his speech from? And he doesn't speak like a child at all. His conversation is completely adult. He often fails to understand what the children mean until they explain it to him. It makes you think that he'd never again spoken to a child before. Wherever he comes from, Elsa, we're deeply indebted to him, and since his worries to be questioned about his background, then I think we ought to let him alone. And I can't see either of any of the things you've mentioned about unsuitability company for our children. He talks beautifully, he has charming manners, often better than your own youngsters. Elsa, why don't you use your eyes? He can't be a bad influence, and he's had an effect on our own children. I haven't once seen them fighting since he came. No, and it's on the tip of my tongue to say I wish you had. You ask me what I have against David. I object his attitude to Carlo, and I object his relations with Maria. Haven't you seen that David hates Carlo? Not like boys who fight and then forget about it because there's nothing really serious to fight over. David hates Carlo as in a grown man hates. He talks to him only when he has to, and then speaks politely and coldly and refuses to look at him. Try watching Carlo a little more closely tomorrow. He's grown quite subdued, and when he sees David and Andrea chatting together, he just stands there looking miserable. He seems to know what if there is if he joined in. David would immediately be the conversation to a polite close and go off somewhere else. Carlo's a good boy, and he's a little wild, somewhat domineering, but otherwise there's no harm to him. Do you suppose it gives me any pleasure to see my eldest son trying to interrogate himself, whilst lying a little vagabond and being beruffled and hatred and contempt? No, of course not, but don't you think there might be mistaken? Suppose we ask David. And I like his influence over Maria just as little. Maria worships the ground he treads on. Everything David thinks and says and does it right. She is aware of the existence of her own brothers only when it suits David. And that's what she likes best, being alone with David. The other day she sat there quite still for a whole hour listening. What do you make of that? Said Maria about the musical. Well, yes, it can't do any harm, my dear. Small girls often admire a little old boy little older than them themselves. And you must remember that it was David who rescued her from the fire. It's quite natural for her to admire him. She used to admire Carlo and Andrea as well, but not in the same way. She admired the two bigger boys because they were stronger and more daring. With David, it's himself that she admires. She seems to want to know and understand everything she thinks so that she can learn and think the same way for herself. Giovanni, I just won't have it. I've listened to the two of them together when they didn't know I was there. With the rest of us, David is silent. But he talks to Maria because it never occurs to her to question him, except to ask him what she thinks about things. He tells her the most wild things about wickedness and misery and brutality. And he's told her how can't die, so that doesn't hurt. And I don't know where he gets it all from, and I don't care either. That boy must go. I should never have thought David had a brutal mind or inclination to cruelty. He hasn't. He tells her such things that she can take care of herself, and so many know how fortunate she is. But I'll not have Maria's innocent carefree childhood spoilt by a knowledge of evil she had no idea of. Children have their own troubles. They mustn't be expected to bear the miseries and sorrows of the grown-up world. Well, since you feel so strongly about it then, but don't you think perhaps I should speak to the boy about it? Do you think that anything at all anyone could do to say to David would alter by one jot of what he thinks? Do you think that anybody in the world could stop David being David? No, my dear, I don't. But I don't think that they could, and I don't think that I have respect for him. The lad isn't obstinate or headstrong, and he wants to learn, but he reserves the right to think for himself, and he'll not surrender his personality, and that's good. It shows strength of character. Giovanni, I'm not heartless. I really am grateful and unwillingly do anything for the boy, but keep him here. I don't believe there's any real harm in him, and I can see a great deal of what you say about him is right. If he weren't a child, I should most probably like for those very things, but I just don't understand him, and I won't have him influencing my own children. Can't you find out something about him? Try to tell him we wish him well and see if you could discover where he comes from. If he's done something wrong, then you could use your influence with the police. We could send him home or to a monastery or something of the sort and pay for his education, but you'll have to tell you the truth so that we can decide on the best thing to do. All right, Elsa, as you wish. You're not to count the cost, and that doesn't matter. He's to have the best of everything: clothes, food, education. For Maria's sake, and because I could have loved him so much if he'd have let me.